So welcome to our panel that I'm moderating, Dreaming for the Generations to Come, Tribal Food Policy, okay? So we have Mark Ford, we have Julie, Aoki at Ralson, we have Richard Elm-Hill, and we have Katie Kosh, so Cook, sorry about that. So welcome them to the stage, and I think someone introduced us to this turbulent time of talking about policy challenges and talking about the realities that we face in Indian country. We're going to hear from our leaders here. They bring their lived experiences, but also their expertise. They've seen transitions in their communities across Indian country, across state work, across local community work, and we'll hear what they have to share. And so remember to use Pigeonhole to ask some questions there if you're interested in asking any of our panelists some questions. So welcome, good morning. Did you have a good evening? Yes, you did? Yeah, so you too? Yeah, so welcome. It takes time to arrive. We just want to recognize that. I want to give the panelists time to introduce themselves and then also to introduce their work. So we'll go ahead and start with you, Mark, and then move down. So go over to you guys.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Ford. I am the Director of Community Engagement for Native and Tribal communities at Feeding America. Some of you maybe have heard of Feeding America. We're the largest nonprofit organization in the country dedicated to ending hunger and food insecurity. Our CEO reminds the staff that that's not a good thing to celebrate, knowing that this country, the richest country in history, has such a huge problem with hunger and food insecurity. So our hope is to be able to work ourselves out of a job. I've been at Feeding America for 4.5 years. I live in Northwest Indiana, a little town called Portage, and I work in our offices in Chicago. Feeding America is an association of food banks and partner agencies. There's 200 food banks around the country that serve all the United States and Puerto Rico. We also have 60,000 partner agencies, which consists of food pantries, schools, meal programs, churches, those who provide food distribution or meals for people in need. A lot of those include tribal pantries. When I first came to Feeding America, we did a landscape assessment and found out there's 84 of our food banks who share geography with our Native and tribal communities around the country. There are 660 plus or minus food pantries in tribal communities or outside of tribal communities that serve those communities. So there's a lot of things we've learned in that, and I'm honored to be part of that team to help build relationships with our tribal communities and between our food banks so that our food banks could better support the needs of our Native and tribal communities throughout the country. The other work I do is to help build coalitions, so intertribal organizations who are looking to support food sovereignty initiatives or other types of initiatives that bring culturally connected foods to communities. So just honored to be with you all and to these wonderful people on the panel. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Julie Ralston, Aoki, and I am the policy coordinator with the Office of American Indian Health and Tribal Relations at the Minnesota Department of Health. And I really feel thankful to be here on the stage with this amazing group of people and with all of you here to be in community, to work in solidarity in advancing tribal food sovereignty and good health for American Indian communities. I have been with that office just since mid-March, so I'm relatively new to the office, but I am thrilled to be there with a great group of people. We are a small but mighty team that is working to advance tribal public health and tribal sovereignty, working in partnership with the 11 federally recognized tribes that share geography with the state of Minnesota, and also with our urban American Indian community partners. And what I really love about that work is that we are both taking an inside-outside strategy, and that we are working both to look across the system, say within the Department of Health, about how we can help the agency improve and be better partners to our tribal nations and American Indian communities, but also be there as a voice to lift up and amplify and advocate for tribal nations and their public health work, including their tribal food sovereignty work and American Indian community work. And I need to say, of course, that I'm here representing myself. The opinions I say today may not necessarily represent the viewpoints of the agency, but again, I'm really glad to be here. I've been here, I think, to almost every conference. So I got my start, I'm a lawyer. I was raised in the Midwest. I'm Japanese American. And I moved here to Minnesota after I graduated from law school, and I got my start at the Attorney General's office here doing consumer protection and antitrust work, so very different. And then after about 10 years, I moved to a national public health technical assistance organization called the Public Health Law Center. And there I worked for almost 18 years. I became the director of healthy eating and active living, where my job included working with tribal nations and tribal public health advocates on advancing food sovereignty and food systems policy. And so it was there that I really started learning about the work being done to support tribal food sovereignty, and also was able to put some of my experience and learnings in Indian law and tribal law to work and to support that work. And I found that incredibly rewarding and meaningful. And also, I also saw it help me to build out the work there at the Center in support of tribal public health law and policy in general. And so moving to the Office of American Indian Health and Tribal Relations seemed like a very natural jump for me, because I felt like it was a way to expand that work and to have a farther reach and to really help people think about how to use the public health sector as well. As we know, as we heard yesterday from some of the stories, like the group in Hawaii talking about their work, many of those folks work in health, public health. And so I feel like part of my role here on this panel is to represent that public health sector, and also how, if you are in a state or in a place where there are good relationships with the other governments around you, that there can be good opportunities to partner and work on tribal food sovereignty work. And I would like to share some of the great work that is happening here in Minnesota with the tribes that we share geography with. So thank you. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. My name is Richard Elm-Hill. I'm a member of the Oneida Nation. I work for an organization called First Nations Development Institute, and I'm the Associate Director of our Native Agriculture and Food Systems Investments program. So I found my way into this food space, but for me, it started a long time before that. So since we're at somewhat of a health conference, I want to share a little bit about some of my family's work. So my great-grandmother, Rosa Manoka Hill, was the second woman to graduate medical school in the United States in Philadelphia. She married an Oneida man out on the East Coast, and they moved back to Oneida. So she was Cree and Mohawk, and he was Oneida. And so they moved back home, and they had a farm there, and kept working on that in that space. And you know, the war happened, and everybody left, and so she was the one who really took care of the community when everyone who had medical knowledge was off, you know, fighting or supporting. And so when I come into a space like this, I can't help but think about her face up. And so where our home is positioned now, the tribal clinic is right across the street. And so there's this mirror that happens, looking out into that. And that's a reminder. And so when we're gathered in a space like this, we're mirroring each other and reminding each other. So on her headstone, it says, "You came to visit me when I was sick." And there's little pieces in there, that we carry from our family, from things we hear. And that's a little bit of where we come from. One more person I want to mention is my father, the late Rick Hill. And I grew up in the corner of a lot of meeting rooms and meeting spaces. And what I learned was we're inside of this tribal economic development that's happening, that's actively happening. And so we can think of a time when we didn't have as many supports for our tribes with federal funding or direct support. I've read individuals who've written over 200 grants for their communities during that time to support the programs of tribes, to establish food programs and farms all along the way. So I was fortunate enough to see that from a young age and grow up inside of a tribal farm setting, move away from my community, learn about other Native communities out in the Pacific Northwest, and then be called back home. And so I feel really blessed to be living in my home community in Oneida, but also working for First Nations Development Institute on a national platform to help uplift a lot of the work we do. So we're primarily a grant intermediary, which is really an advocacy role to go create a collective voice for the work that we do across Indian country, not just with foods, culture, language, land, any Native American issue that may rise up. That's what we try to advocate for. So we have a really strong belief in Native communities being able to decide what they want to do in their homes, and also as a collective unit. So we in our foods area, nutrition has been a theme kind of throughout the program. So it starts from health within the family, as you're bringing new children into the world and getting those first foods, all the way up through your education system, whether that be in school or in a language nest or whatever education can and should look like, all the way up through learning and studying and crafting your pen and your story to be able to build up those folks around you. So I come from those places. I'm a learner. I learn from both the work that we do, but also from the families that we represent. So I'm honored to be here with you today.
Bonjour, good morning everyone. My name is Katie Cook. I am a member of the Bad River Tribe, and I have the honor of being the Food Sovereignty Director for my tribe. We border Lake Superior, right in northern Wisconsin there. And my work consists of overseeing a food box program in which we get wonderful local foods out into our community members. We have a site in the heart of our reservation with 3 high tunnels. We do a lot of community programming. We empower our community to grow their own food, to learn how to preserve food. We do a lot of workshops and classes and feasts. We work with the youth. And then I also oversee a farm site. We have a 26-acre farm that we've just got going into production this year. So thank you all. I'm really happy to be here with you.
Thank you everyone for sharing. we could take this in so many different directions because there's just so much happening, and we just only have this panel to talk about policies. And when we look at our priorities and current realities and situations in Indian country, but also in our work with allyship and also with our partners, it's important to recognize that this time that they have here is really critical to what they're sharing. I really want to give them a chance. When I first presented here at the conference, I was a policy presenter on the Healthy Diné Nation Act, and then got voluntold to be an MC. So I'm here as an MC and a moderator. But I used that time to give honor to the Healthy Diné Nation Act when we are so busy involved in the policy work at home on Navajo, trying to pass a 2% unhealthy foods tax. And when I was on the platform here, it was just really critical to get that message out because the narratives are coming from us, right? We're sharing those stories on how we do work. So in your work, in your efforts and current experiences, what issues, policies, or urgencies would you like to share to raise awareness or even to increase visibility around? And we'll start with you, Katie, and we'll move back this way.
Sure. There are a few things I'd like to mention. In terms of policy and funding cuts, one of the most major cuts we've received is with our local food purchasing assistance program. This LFPA, they call it, money has, from the federal government, found its way into hands of food banks, tribal communities, small nonprofits, people who are kind of farmers and middle of the supply chain folks to be able to purchase organic local foods from their communities and get them into the hands of their own community members. And so this was a really wonderful program. It uplifted the farmers. It got our community members eating healthy foods again, nutritious foods. And so it was a really great program that was benefiting everyone all around. And unfortunately, the funding for 2025 and beyond has been cut. So we are thinking of new ways to continue this good work of supporting our local farmers and getting some of their foods into the hands of the people who need it the most. The other things I want to mention regarding policy and changes is, you know, we think of the health of our environment and how that affects our food. And so we all know water is life, right? And without clean water, we can't have clean food. And so there's a couple of issues going on with that. Almost everywhere, there seems to be no regulations on the amount of pesticides and glyphosate that farmers get to spray on their crops. And even along the roadways, like the power line companies like to spray Roundup to keep the weeds down and keep a nice, clean, thorough way for their things. And that, unfortunately, washes away and ends up in our rivers, our creeks, the tributaries, and can come down and it affects our waterways, it affects the crops that we're growing. So there needs to be some sort of regulations against that. Also, you know, up in Bad River, we have the DNR comes in and puts lampricide into our waterways to combat and kill the invasive sea lamprey. But a lot of our community members have concerns about the effects of this chemical. And, you know, it's known to kill the juvenile lampreys, and when the walleye and the other fish come and feast on these juvenile lampreys, it gets into their system. And we as tribal members are fishing and eating the walleye, and so then how is that affecting us? How is this lampricide affecting the wild rice and the pesticides that are coming into the river? So these are really, you know, issues that are pertinent everywhere with the pesticides. I mean, a lot of us are, you know, involved in growing really good, healthy organic food or supporting those who are. But we still have these big farmers to compete with. And the last thing I'll say is particular to Bad River, we have an ongoing battle with Enbridge and their Line 5 right now. So they are a Canadian oil tar sands company. Their pipeline goes right through the heart of our reservation. Our tribal council said, nope, we are not going to renew your lease. You've been operating here illegally for the past 70 years. Please leave. Enbridge took it to court, and it's been this ongoing battle. And so now they're proposing the Line 5 reroute, which goes all around the bottom part of our reservation, and it crosses all these streams, rivers, tributaries, and if there's ever a rupture in that pipeline moving forward, it will go into our Bad River, it'll go into our watershed, and potentially worst case scenario, make its way to Lake Superior. So that's a really ongoing hot topic right now, is the battles between our community and the Enbridge Line 5 pipeline that could affect our water and our food for the future.
Thank you. Over to you, Richard.
Yeah, we see, we're in philanthropic circles. That's the space I'm coming at this question from. And so one of the things that we look at with federal funding is the role that philanthropy can add to fill that gap. But what is that gap that we're trying to fill? So as we look at these clawbacks, so we know that 1/2 of 1% of all philanthropic funds go to support Native communities. And just to give you an idea of what that looks like, if you take $1 and you go to the bank and you get 100 pennies, and then you take one of those pennies and you break it in half, and then you have a 1/2 penny, and then you go to a bandsaw and you cut off another portion of that penny, that's how much money of the funds that are coming toward us that we get to split up across of all the issues that we try to resource within our communities. It's not just food, that's for everything. And so when we hear that the federal government removed a program that supports, food access, Native producers, schools being able to have choice to buy their foods at the tune of $500,000, that penny is worth $400 million. And they just took away $500 million. And so the dependence that we have as tribal communities on that resource of coming from the federal government is immense. We, as a community, should demand more from the philanthropic sector, but they're not the full answer to support the gaps that have just been taken away recently. Not only the ones that have been taken away recently, but over time. So as these clawbacks continue to happen, we embody some of this, let's just call it trauma, as it reverberates across our generations to continue to experience something that's been given and then taken away. So we're learning as small organizations, as well-resourced tribes, how to build relationships with other places that can offer support, and so the other sectors might be, wealthy donors who can support tribes directly. They might be through businesses that are collaborating with the tribe directly or other Native nonprofits. So we're getting better at positioning ourselves to not be affected as much in these federal, unfortunate, and very real situations. And so I see us being supportive to one another as we, in the short term, figure out which way to move and grow. We're being asked all the time, what project can I do for 25 grand? That contains our thinking. So when these federal, if we, get in a position to acquire and secure a federal fund, and they've asked us to dream, larger than we dreamed in terms of this money space, that is still valuable. And so we have those pathways created where we've done the work to envision what are the real root causes of this that we need to send all of our energy to, so we can change the power dynamics, not only in the funding, but in the way we deliver programming, in the way that we're accessing a lot of our people. And we know when we put those decisions in the hands of Native people, they reinvent what those kinds of food programs or health programs really look like. And so, I believe we have, the ability in this room to follow the path that we're on, regardless of if we have the federal funding support beyond this administration or not.
Thank you, Richard. Over to you, Jen.
Yeah, and I was sitting here thinking as you were talking about Richard and Katie, I came out of the nonprofit world too for a while, and it is a little bit ironic that I think sometimes the bigger your proposal is, the bigger your dream is, the more likely it will be granted. And so it's like sometimes I think you can impose sort of limits on yourself by trying to be modest and trying to be humble or realistic, and then you end up actually shortchanging yourself. It's just a weird dynamic that can happen that way. But so I come at this thinking through my policy hat, and I really appreciated yesterday that Denisa raised up the Native American Seed Protection Act. Yeah, so and we all know that the federal government is not really the place to look right now, but there are some nuggets that I wanted to lift up at the federal level for people to have on their radar, and so that was one of them. It's HR 9887, in case anybody wants to note that down. It was introduced last fall. And then there's another bill that was introduced in June this year. It was a bipartisan bill, the Food Distribution Program in Indian Reservations Act of 2025, HR 3956, which seeks to permanently authorize tribes to enter into self-determination contracts to administer the FDIPR, or the Commodity Foods Program. And so that's, again, a small thing, sort of, but also a big thing in recognizing that tribes should have the autonomy and be able to exercise their sovereignty in administering a program that is meant to feed their people. And then another small little nugget of hope was just last week or 2 weeks ago, Congress has released their draft fiscal year 2026 Labor, Health and Human Services Education Appropriations Bill. And the House version, not the Senate version, but the House version did increase funding for the Good Health and Wellness in Indian Country program by $6 million, going from $24 to $30 million. So, and that's a program, if you're familiar with it, that does support food systems work, also physical activity, and also work around commercial tobacco cessation and support. So those are some things that are happening at the federal level. I would encourage you, if you don't already, to follow the Native Farm Bill Coalition. That's the Shakopee Metawakan Sioux community is one of the leaders in that coalition, and they have been doing a lot of work over the past decade to make the Farm Bill a Native Farm Bill. And then also the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative at the University of Arkansas Law School does a lot of work in that area, as well as the Intertribal Agricultural Council. So they're all very much on top of the Native Farm Bill work. And so then, and as you mentioned, Richard, too, I think that keeping up the fight and the pressure on the federal government to uphold the federal trust responsibility is so important in these times, especially right now. And with all the uncertainty and the turbulence that we're seeing, of course, we need to look at other sources as well. And so, as I mentioned before, if there for you all who are from tribes or communities where there are good relationships, or at least constructive relationships with your state and local governments around you, there could be opportunities to find support, whether it's through partnership, whether funding, other kinds of support for the work that you are doing. And that support is not going to make up for all the federal funding cuts. Like at the state, we also rely heavily on federal funding. I've heard our commissioner talk about how the health department is 50% funded by federal funds. So, obviously that impacts us too, but there are still opportunities, and there's ways to think creatively about the funds that are out there and that are being allocated. And in Minnesota, we are lucky to be in a state, again, where there's been a long time commitment to working in a government-to-government basis with tribes. Our state law, we have a state law that requires every state agency and department to have a tribal liaison or a tribal relations director, and to hold periodic consultations, formal consultations with every tribe here, and also additional as requested. So, I think the state, it's again not perfect, but works very hard to honor that government-to-government relationships. And we've also been doing work to change our funding formulas so that rather than asking tribes to compete for funding, we seek to have legislation designed to mark funding as a set-aside or an allocation, and so then that is distributed on a formula basis and a formula that's determined in consultation with the tribes. So again, trying to avoid pitting tribes against each other for scarce resources. I wanted to just share a few examples of some of the funding that the state has made available or works with tribes to distribute to support food sovereignty and other types of public health efforts. So one example is our tribal SHIP program, which is SHIP stands for Statewide Health Improvement Partnership. And that's a program that's been around more than a decade. And it's, again, it's a lot like the GWIC program, or Good Health and Wellness in Indian Country, although it came before the GWIC program. And again, it funds projects around food sovereignty, food systems work, food policy, also physical activity, and then there's also funding for commercial tobacco-related work. But through that work, tribes and American Indian communities who share geography with us have been working on things like healthy food access through community-based agriculture, doing gardens and orchards and even farms, running community produce stands, farmers markets, and also using that funding to support Indigenous lifeways work, such as working on foraging, doing berry camps, wild ricing, and medicine harvesting, including cultural teachings about traditional foods and medicines, and doing some policy work, say, around worksite wellness or healthy food policies for their organizations. And then focused on tribal food sovereignty specifically, we have 2 new funding streams that are coming out, and one is through the Department of Children, Family, and Youth. So I know they're one of the sponsors here today, and I think there's several people from that agency here. But they were appropriated $1 million to support tribal food sovereignty work specifically. And then also MDH, in partnership with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, MPCA, and also the DNR, are jointly together rolling out a series of what's called Climate Smart Food System grants, which is $200 million in funding, and $15 million of which has been earmarked for tribal food sovereignty work specifically. And so these are grants that are currently being rolled out. And so if you are a tribe that shares geography with us, those would be opportunities that you could look for. And I also think they could be opportunities, things like that, for folks from other places to look for. And then I wanted to tell people, we also have some tribal public health funding streams that, although they're not specifically focused on food sovereignty work, they have so much flexibility that there's opportunities for tribes to use that to advance that work if they so choose. So for example, we have 2 different public health infrastructure types of grants, which both say that they're to be used for public health infrastructure or foundational public health responsibilities as determined by the tribe. So if a tribe has determined that food sovereignty work is a necessary component of their public health work, then that could be a good fit for some of that work. Also, we have a grant called the American Indian Special Emphasis Grant, which is funding for tribes and urban communities to develop community-based solutions to address health disparities arising from cumulative and historical discrimination. And one of the tribes that is receiving that funding is using this grant to provide cultural immersion events such as rabbit snaring, wild rice harvesting, deer hunting, and finishing and netting, and accompanying those workshops with cultural teachings and storytelling around gathering, hunting, dressing, preserving, and preparation of food in a culturally appropriate manner. So these are grants that are being used to support tribal food sovereignty. Similarly, an urban American Indian organization is using their grant to do a similar type of thing to support a traditional foods program, working with a native chef who is preparing meals for both the staff and the program participants that are using traditional foods such as bison and walleye and wild rice, and also learning about how to forage, who's working with the respected elder from the community to both learn himself about foraging and also to exploring the opportunities to teach youth about it to prepare the next generation of people who can work to support tribal food sovereignty. So these are just some opportunities that are out there, and I think people may not think to look at public health funding, for example, or some of these other types of funding streams. So that could be places to look.
Thank you, Julie. Mark?
Thank you, fellow panelists, for the great information you shared. Feeding America, we have a government relations team that monitors how policies are impacting, and I work with them looking at how it impacts Native and tribal communities. I had the privilege to go to the National Congress of American Indians executive session in Washington, D.C. back in February when the administration was just coming in, and there was a lot of fear and a lot of panic around, how funding cuts and policy changes were impacting Indian country. And some of the couple things I want to highlight that were mentioned there was, how tribes are not DEI programs. They're sovereign nations, and that our government has obligations and trust responsibilities in helping tribes. And I was glad they said that. The other things that they brought up is there was concern about ICE agents stopping and detaining tribal members, especially those who live along the border area, racial profiling. There was concern about cutting to important funds like clean water or environmental protection, preserving sacred sites for tribes. There was a lot of fear about that. The other thing that was mentioned, which I was really glad to hear, is the concern on how our LGBTQ plus two-spirit relatives are being treated and targeted, and how many of those funding programs that support them have disappeared. So those were some of the major things that that tribes have mentioned at that. And what helped me realize is I was glad that tribes were doubling down and saying we are not DEI programs. But what I've realized through that is that a lot of our nonprofit organizations, tribes that are not federally recognized, our American Indian urban centers who provide all kinds of services, that those weren't included in that. So I think one of the things we need to do is to make sure we protect our relatives, our organizations, our American Indian urban centers, our nonprofit organizations like First Nation, Indigenous Food and Agricultural Initiative, and those others that are part of the Native Farm Bill Coalition, that we also support them, that we just don't separate ourselves as federal tribes from non-federal tribes or other organizations, but that we work together. And so we want to make sure that no one is left out during this time. We are an ally to the Native Farm Bill Coalition, so we kind of monitor the conversations and what tribes are looking for. And one of the good things that happened is that with the new SNAP regulations, the Supplemental Nutrition Program that tribes do not have to follow the same regulations or requirements around work and other stipulations. So they've been exempt from that. And that's grateful work for some of our congressional leaders on both sides of the aisles who are pushing that. We need to really press on getting a farm bill to the table and passed. It's been tabled for the last 2 years, and we need to get that going because there's so many wonderful initiatives that support many of the programs that are represented here. So we need to really get that farm bill. Last year, I worked with the National Association of FDIPR Administrators. There was a crisis last year because USDA decided to go down to one vendor and one warehouse, and many of our tribal communities were not getting those commodity food programs. So we worked with NA-FDIPR and some of our nonprofit organizations to resolve that issue. And now I'd love to hear what you just shared, Julie, about them being able to operate and run those programs rather than being led by USDA. So those are just a couple things I wanted to raise as concerns. We really need to support our relatives who are been targeted and also who have been alienated from a lot of the funding and policy support.
Thank you for sharing that. Aaron Parker presented to us the last conference on the Native Farm Bill, and Aaron's really busy right now, and we really need to support our relatives in that. But also our matriarch, Janie Hip, who was on the General Council of the USDA. She is still continuing to do important work, working in philanthropy now. And so she's, very busy too, just trying to see the foresight, what Indian country is doing and what we should be doing, what we should be preparing for. But you all presented challenges that is what brings us here, is what pushes us to create strategies and curate those solutions for our communities. And that's what we did on Navajo. We led the Healthy Diné Nation Act because of those issues. And I've worked, with most of you here. And that was a really critical thing, 2012 when we came together. As of last year, 2024, we've raised over $17 million at partial compliance. That's funded thousands of community wellness projects in all 110 Navajo chapters. And this is funding that, where would we get that funding? We didn't see the budget cuts coming. We didn't see the pandemic coming. We wrote in the policy at that time that we had health emergency preparedness written in there. But we have that ancestral insight that says we got to prepare for the future. We need to pass these bills. We need to pass the Native Seed Protection Act. We need to increase our partnerships. We need to be able to know how to navigate and decolonize solidarity and what does that look like in our communities. And that's why we're here. And I hope that everyone's connecting. If you have questions for our panelists, get to know, their work, but also how do you connect? How can they be an example to you and your communities? So as we know that community holds power and collective solidarity is healing and true healing to the core, not only just physically in the food that we're eating, but also emotionally and physically, and also spiritually, psychologically. All of these different aspects are very connected to what solutions that we bring to our community. How we can build community and connect coalition is important to address these challenges, right? And I want to ask them, what are some opportunities that you would like to share? I know Julie has shared several, but what are some opportunities that some folks here may not be aware of, but also what should we be looking forward to? Because if we can create, and Navajo is the only tribe and only part of the U.S. that has the only unhealthy food tax. And I think that's so commendable. Because if we could do something like that and do a 2% tax on even if it's chips, candy, and soda to create and generate revenue and change our communities, because what regulations are being put on these unhealthy food companies? We're just seeing them come in. One more comment. I was really excited to see in the poster session Hannah Shai, who's from the Mariana Islands, and she was presenting on a soda consumption there, and we helped to advise. They're trying to pass an ad valorem tax for years. And The companies are bringing in these shipments of unhealthy food into the island, and no one's have any say, over how much is being brought in. And so I really hope we can have an unhealthy food tax conference to be able to talk about these things, and number 2 conference too, okay? Because it's all related. Okay, let's present some other opportunities, okay? Go ahead, Mark.
There's a few things I'd like to mention. First of all, recognizing Dr. Janie Hipp. She's such an incredible leader. And I remember a conversation I had with her when I worked for a different organization a few years back. And we were talking about partnering together as an opportunity. And she said, so many of us, and Richard mentioned this, we compete with each other for the same dollars, for the same support. And she said, we need to be like a pack of wolves. We need to come together and hunt and then share the spoils. So for me, that's about building coalitions. Part of the work that I support with our food banks is having them work with intertribal organizations within their service area to build up food sovereignty coalitions, or being able to promote more food sovereignty initiatives. But it's going to take coming together and not competing with one another. So building coalitions I think is the way to go. We saw that during the pandemic, and we hear this all the time, how we became innovative as a result of that. Our food banks, our food pantries had to learn how to distribute food without human contact. So drive-through distribution points, or delivering boxes to people's homes. There was even some food banks who did like a kind of Amazon lockers where you get a code and you can pull out your food box. So finding innovative ways of working through this crisis together, and it is a crisis that we're going through. Looking at how we can, again, support our relatives and those organizations out there. I want to give a shout out to our Ohana from Hawaii, who are not federally recognized, but they're doing incredible work out there. We heard that yesterday. And how do we support them? How do we support, again, our LGBTQ relatives? How do we support our American urban Indian centers? There's 41 across the country that serve our Indigenous people who live in urban areas like I do. And they don't get a lot of support that, tribes should be reaching out, supporting, because we're serving their tribal members. So building coalitions, I think, is so important, a way to go. And again, sharing about FDIPR, how as a result of this crisis that happened last year that disrupted the food getting out, now there's an opportunity for self-governance, self-determination within that program. So I think it's just looking for those opportunities and building coalitions in different ways.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think building off that theme, I think from the government or public health sector side of things, I think it is so easy, for people to be in silos too. And I think just some of the examples we've talked about where like the climate smart food systems work, for example, that's a collaboration between the Department of Health, a pollution control agency, and Department of Natural Resources. So I think, and even with the tribal government, even reaching out across the different departments, so the health department and also the environmental department, environmental health, which can be a separate part of the government, as well as the DNR or the forestry department. Often you think it's one government, but yet they're still working in their sort of discrete areas, and it takes time and effort and actually just a little bit of thinking sometimes about building those partnerships. So I think advocates can play a really important role there in prompting that kind of coalition building thinking across a government. And I just want to go back to the Diné Nation junk food or unhealthy food tax law. And, I think an important part of that story too, was the amazing coalition building work you did for years there, right?
Over a decade,
Yeah, and then also a piece of it was that a reduction in the tax for certain healthy items, right? So like that, those two, and even with that reduction in tax, the tax brought in a really important revenue. And I think that kind of strategic thinking comes out of coalition and groups thinking together to come up with more creative ideas about how to get, nobody likes taxes. Tax proposals are hard to pass, but when you can partner it with an idea like reducing the tax on things that are healthy, that can build the buy-in. And you only get those ideas when you work in coalition across a diverse group of partnerships.
Thank you, Julie.
Yeah, I want to lift up, in our planning call, we talked a bit about the Tribal Elder Food Box program, because I know we all supported that program from a different angle of some sort. And it really exemplifies a model of tribes coming together to solve similar issues, largely on food distribution. So in this grant making perspective, we've given, 1.3 million away to, say, roughly like 80 organizations. And so we see example after example of the themes moving towards more traditional foods within our distribution programs. And so that shift right there is actually pretty significant as we look at food distribution, the model, saying, hey, I'm gonna give you enough food to last you to the week. That's the old model. Our model is, I need traditional foods going to feed elders and youth, and we need to learn how to make these foods, and we're gonna share them with our families and make sure we're sustained and empowered through reconnecting to culture, reconnecting to our tastes and our memories. And so now we combine that with 13 tribes in a region. That is hard to say no to. We want to say, yes, let's do more of this. So as we look region to region, what does that look like, say, in the Southwest or in the Northeast or in Alaska? So we are already thinking with this kind of coalition mindset in certain pockets, on certain levels, like food distribution, but it can happen elsewhere. I also wanted to point out that, our conversation today has been a lot around federal, I'd say the federal policy level, and that there's more arenas to participate in, local level, tribal level, regional, at your state level. We can get into the Indigenous conversation globally, and with each of those levels, there are different conversations happening that we might be able to bring back to our community. Just yesterday, a colleague of mine shared about corn being written into the constitution of a place. What happens when our traditional foods are written into our guiding documents, or written into, so that's on the higher end, or written into our school systems, things that we have readily control to be able to put these ideas forward. I've heard of an organic certification that's actually supported by the community, and so you're being upheld from the community who eats your food rather than from the U.S. government or someone who doesn't live in your community to kind of uphold what the policies are. And so when we will usually get into how do we enforce these policies, but the other side of that is, not always being in an enforcement response relationship, but more in a communal relationship that we're more accustomed to, and rebuild back that trust and accountability to build a culture around a food system that ensures that we have an abundance of our traditional foods. We're following our cultural protocols. We're more aware about what the issues are so we can have a collective voice to address some of the things that are happening.
Thank you, Richard. Katie?
Yeah, Richard, I'm really glad you brought up the tribal elder food boxes, because that is a really beautiful example of a coalition coming together in light of a really tough situation, right? The Great Lakes Intertribal Food Coalition, GLIFC, formed in response due to the pandemic. And they came together with delegates of one of each of the 11 tribes in the state of Wisconsin. And they partnered with Feeding America. So these partnerships forming and these coalitions are really key during this time. And so Feeding America has allowed Glyphsy the space to aggregate and pack their boxes, which then go out and are distributed to all 11 federally recognized tribes in the state of Wisconsin. And so our elders every other week are able to receive a really beautiful box of Indigenous foods. And the Indigenous producers that sell to the food boxes through this wonderful coalition Glyphsy, have increased. I think they just started with a few Indigenous producers, and now they're up to 36. So it really, these coalitions have this amazing capacity to build up our communities and to ripple out. And Richard also touched on the fact that, you know, this is such a beautiful model that's been very successful, and we can, in other parts of the world and other tribal communities, learn from what's going on here in the Midwest and adopt these models for your own communities. Mm-hmm. One of the other things we're doing in Bad River is we are exploring adopting our tribal model food code, our Bad River model food code. And this is based on work that Glyphwick has done. So Glyphwick has a model food code template that tribes can work off of and adopt. And that is important because under federal regulations, as it stands, tribal harvesters cannot take, for example, deer, venison, and sell that to tribal programs like our Early Head Start or our Elderly Center within tribes. Currently, a tribal member could harvest a deer and gift it to another tribal member, no problem. But once that deer goes into a facility for larger distribution, even if it's to its own community of tribal members, that is illegal, and it needs to have some regulations. And so working with adopting this tribal model food code allows our nations to say, you know, we are sovereign and we have the ability to feed our own people, and we're doing so in a safe way. So we're not going to raise any red flags. You know, we as tribal people have always fed ourselves, and we are inherently resilient. And so just continuing to do that, but knowing some of these policies and ways that we are able to do that in a way that doesn't raise any red flags, as I mentioned. And I like how Julie also talked about the silos. So sometimes in our own tribal communities, we can get really siloed. You know, we have our different programs and our different departments, and we're all very busy and we're all doing really good work. But just to remember to work with each other within our tribal communities. So like our food sovereignty program in Bad River, we really work closely with our clinic. We work closely with our Boys and Girls Club. We work closely with our Early Head Start, our Elderly Center. And so really bringing in together your communities through this good food sovereignty and food systems work is important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you all for sharing that. I think also too, it's really critical. It's UNESCO's Decade of Indigenous Languages from 2022 to 2032, bringing in our languages into the work. My tribe, we don't have a constitution, but we have a code. How do we integrate that into the languages? Richard, we talked about this on our call, and talking about the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. You know, it's not supported by the U.S., but how do we include those rights and the words that come from those international agreements and documents to put that into our Constitution and codes is really important. Richard, I talked about United Nations. I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit on your experience on that, but I think it's important to recognize the international relationships that we do have as Indigenous peoples, as partners and coalitions, to build around that movement, because that's really critical when it comes to the sovereignty of our people. The other thing that I also want to mention is that, the Healthy Dinner Nation Act, RFK came to the Navajo Nation and said, how are you guys doing the unhealthy food tax? And this is something we did not expect, to be speaking about this. And they went to Hojon Academy. I pointed out the couple that was here that are part of that. And at Hojon Academy, by the time they graduate high school, they know how to grow their own food. And so the youth are very critical in connecting with tribal elected leaders, elected officials at every level, like you said, Mark, whether that's the local, all the way to the national, but also the international level. I served 5 years as the first woman to be elected as a Slow Food International Council of the Global North. And so my work has really been based, on those efforts, like how do we connect community across the world, even though, like we're all doing, very critical work that is diversified, but how do we join together in these spaces? And so when we talk about the youth and when we talk about how do we encourage the youth, my father always said, Denisa, you're gonna go to law school. As a kid, I didn't know what that meant. Like when your parents are telling you, you're gonna go to law school, you don't know really what that means. But I fulfilled that for my father. I went to OU Law and graduated in Indigenous Peoples Law. And it really took me into perspective of the international frameworks. I already had been an elected official before, but we need more schools to teach about those relationships from the international level down to the local level. And it's key to understand those documents and important movements. We had a presentation a couple years ago at this conference to, speak about the international work that's being done. But what is your advice when it comes to the youth or even folks that are new in the room to be able to get involved and to raise their awareness, but also what are the starting points? Because youth, have all these amazing ideas. And I believe in Indian country doing this difficult food work and leading the Healthy Dinner Nation Act for over a decade now. It's like we're on a road trip. And we get everybody involved. I say that you have the driver, and then you have the co-pilot. You have probably one in the back that's just napping the whole time. You have the one that's probably playing the good music. Then you have those that are at home that are funding the project that can't go on the trip. They're like, I'll support you from this, from this standpoint. But I believe that we're on this road trip. And so the youth have an important role at some point, and they need to embrace that because we're not dedicating that time specifically saying, you youth, this is your job, this is your priority, and have them accept that, because that's a really beautiful thing when we get them involved, especially in policy work. So Katie, we'll start with you and move back here. What is your advice for youth or anything that you want to share regarding strategies or even your experience?
Sure, yeah. My advice for the youth would just be to follow what lights you up, really. Follow what your heart feels passionate about, or even what you feel even slightly curious about, and then pairing with a mentor. So mentorship is key for these youth. They can really make all of the difference. And just for the youth to allow themselves the opportunity to really immerse themselves in this work, whatever it is within the food policy sector or otherwise that lights them up. And that would mean putting your phone down. I know that sounds so rudimentary, but we have these amazing distraction devices at our fingertips. And so to remember to allow yourself that opportunity to really dive into what you're interested in and what lights you up, and leave the distraction. Very simple, but that's what I would say.
I will add on this other piece, I think, of Native nutrition and mental health. So, as I look at families or just observe what's happening in kid land, they're navigating this space, and we're learning a lot from not only what's happening at school, but emphasis on what's happening in home and building those support systems around the kids. So having something like traditional foods to follow as a model of where we get our source of information to learn in community is a really important piece to try to create that type of environment. I went to school knowing that I would be in education that wouldn't be with inside four walls. That was the emphasis. I had to figure out what that looked like and find, you know, my way and our family's way back to our corn culture. And so we spend 1,000 hours, you know, planting and harvesting by hand 1 acre of corn. And we know that because we've tracked that and put the time into doing that. Other communities ask, how do you get so many people to contribute and volunteer their time like that? And we're figuring out the answer to that. We're staying open and we're learning as we go. So one of the things is how to create that belonging for families who aren't, you know, who are mixed families or intertribal families. We have families who come from 2 different tribes or one part of their family is tribal, and they need a sense of belonging, not for them, but primarily for the model that it sets to the kids so they can learn up and experience things that they're going to carry with them for a long time. So I'll add one more point here. Our food team has supported a few projects around traditional butchering this year. And what it's done is created a moment where there's deep learning and experience that we're going to call back onto in 30, 40, 50 years to retell that story. And so in terms of education, we need to create spaces that offer that to our youth, where they have more so a memory of something that they can carry with them. So no matter where they go, they can draw upon that to inform the things they want to put in place. And so they're teaching each other amongst their friend groups, into every community that they're going in, but they're also modeling what we're offering them on a daily basis. And so I feel like following our traditional foods as a primary teacher, we need to follow that.
Just +1 to what Katie and Richard were saying, and I was thinking the mentoring piece, especially I think is so important for, like, if you're a young person and you found something that lights your fire, like finding a good mentor to help you. And then I think it's also, as Richard was talking about, learning from our traditional foods and modeling. I think it's also on us adults as also to think about how we are receiving the questions and the ideas that are coming from youth too, because I know as a parent, like my kids are saying stuff to me and I'm just like, rolling my eyes like, no, that's never going to work. But if you have that mindset, it will never work. And so I think it's also on us to think about what we are modeling for youth and also being open to being challenged. And I also wanted to add to your point, Denisa, about looking to Indigenous and international law too, that I think there is some really exciting ideas that are coming out of that maybe in the US law system, it feels like that's not a good fit, but change only happens if people keep trying. And so I think about things like the rights of Manumin or the White Earth tribe here has been advancing, or the rights of natural, like lakes and rivers and other natural entities that comes out of international law now that people in the United States are also trying to inject into our legal system. And so far they haven't had much success, but that's how change happens, right? You have to keep trying. And so I grew up, my mom always told me where there's a will, there's a way. And so I firmly believe that if you really truly have a passion and a fire, that you have to keep trying and you can't give up on it. Finally, I just want to say, I'm so glad that Katie, you brought up the Glyphwick model food code, because also I think in this, compared to when I started working in this area, like even 15 years ago, there are so many more tools and resources that are out there to support work. You don't have to start from scratch. So there are things like that tribal food code, model food code. There's the IFAI, Indigenous Food and Agricultural Initiatives, model food and farm code. So there are model codes that are out there that they need to be adapted to the specific tribal context, but you don't have to start from scratch. And in the same way, within your own community, there could be policy documents to build off of, like looking into your constitution, looking at your tribal code, looking at things like there's these plan documents, they're called, which are actually also policy documents. There are things like a comprehensive plan, it's called, which is a plan, like usually a 5 or 10-year plan for a whole a nation or a community about what that community has decided they want to look like in 10 years or 5 years. It sets goals, and usually there can be public health or there can be food sovereignty goals in that plan. So looking at those and holding your leaders accountable to how are they making progress on this plan. Similarly, there can be climate adaptation plans that might also include work that's important for food sovereignty work. Your health department might do what's called a tribal health needs assessment or a community health needs assessment. And in that assessment, access to healthy traditional foods could be part of that assessment. So you can be part of those process of making those plans, but then also looking at the plans that do exist and thinking how can you leverage those to bring your arguments, to bring your ideas to leadership and ask them to be accountable to these plan documents that have already been created by community. So I hope that these are some ideas. And finally, I have to say, that I would love it if more Native kids went to law school and became lawyers, because we need more lawyers, Native lawyers who really can understand and are passionate about food sovereignty work and can support policy work in that area.
Thank you, Julie.
My message is for the adults and not for the youth, because I think the youth are our teachers. I'm a self-proclaimed favorite uncle among my nieces and nephews and my great nieces and nephews. And I have learned from them that, you can tell I'm an elder because I talk about the good old days. When I was a kid growing up, there was like an innocence that doesn't exist in these younger generations. I was isolated from what was happening in the world, and news wasn't instant. It wasn't in front of me on my phone or anything like that. I didn't have a phone. And so understanding that these youth have a multi-dimension aspect that they bring to us. They can multitask, they can multi-concept. They have a self-awareness and consciousness that I could have never even imagined having when I was young. So I think it's important for us, like you said, to provide mentorship and support to build trust. I love the quote that Rowan shared yesterday about relationships are the build of the speed of trust. But the second part of that is that social actions happen as a result of relationships, or at the speed of relationships. And so building those relationships and supporting our youth are so important. And not to go against having youth become lawyers or study law, but I want to see the artistic side. I want to see the innovative side being mentored. I think this next generation is a generation that can really make a difference. They've seen what we've done wrong, and I think they have a vision of what can be done right. So let's support our youth in that.
They can become the next Mark, the next Julie, the next Richard, the next Katie, the next Denisa.
Hopefully a better version.
A better version. The true AI, right? We don't want to ask AI to help us write the codes. We want to ask the true AI how to write codes, right? And so just be reminded about that. It's just great, to hear your expertise, but your experience in influencing, everyone here. And I think, your presence even speaks volumes, to be here on the stage to present what you have shared. There's so much to cover. There's so much to talk about, and also to go in depth. We could have this all day in conversing about this. But one thing I want to do, remind folks, is that in the job postings, please put those opportunities for the youth too. If there's some fellowships, or if there's some internships, some ideas that you have for the youth, please use that. Because I had a youth come up to me yesterday and she said, I lost my house in the tornado. I lost my job, and I didn't even think I would come here to the conference. I got a scholarship to come to the conference. And she said, I'm looking for a job. I'm looking for a home. I'm looking for my next, phase of action. And so we don't know what we've been through. We don't look like what we've been through, and we don't know what people are going through. And so those job postings, please, share. Please talk with our folks here if you have any questions. I let the youth know, please talk to Julie, because Julie was like looking like, what if we, get our job cut, and what if we have these budget cuts? What am I going to do? Should I open my own business? Should I open my own consulting? All of these creative things, we need to be able to see the foresight of going forward. There's a youth Ashoka fellowship, if you're a youth, the adult Ashoka fellowship, which is a global fellowship. Nick Tilson, shout out to you, my brother, and then also Chef Sean and I are Ashoka fellows. And that's a lifetime fellowship. I encourage youth to seek out the funding in that fellowship. And I also, before we move on to the pigeonhole questions, really want to recognize that back at home, when the big beautiful bill was passed, Congress made an extension to the RECA, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, that my mom's older brother, Phil Harrison, has been championing for over 30 years to address the contamination of uranium on Navajo. Not only in Navajo, but where there is downwind from when the U.S. government opened the uranium mines and contaminated our air, our water, and our food systems. And we're having the EPA take their time cleaning up, this mess that they've made. And so that has been extended. So if you have any questions about that, my family's been working on that, because my grandfather died from direct contamination of working in the uranium mines to mine uranium for the atomic bomb. And so we're still facing those issues when it comes to our food systems. And so there's much work around policy, around laws, and also the innovation around what we need to curate, but also put in the codes and the constitutions. So let's move to the pigeonhole question here. Can you please provide conference participants with a list of links to the mentioned funding sources that support either food access for tribes or food sovereignty and cultural restoration or reclamation?
Native Americans in Philanthropy did some creation of a map called Investing in Indian Country. Just Google it. I'm not sure the exact name, but it's a wonderful funding map where you can see who got funded, who got awarded funds at which amounts, and who those funders are. So a lot of times this funding is like aligning with the funder looking to support climate or health. And so you can kind of keyword search in there and get a feel for how big maybe my ask should be, how often, and that'll give you a nice, I'd say, running short list to see how can I build relationships with these organizations who are kind of dedicated to support our space. And then I'll lift up one more funder coalition, because when I was brought into this work, I didn't realize that funders got together like this and talked about how they're going to support different areas. That concept was new to me. And so the Sustainable Agriculture and Food System Funders is a collective of funders who support agriculture and food systems. And they have a running list of over 100 members. And so all of them maybe support regionally or are community foundations. And so kind of growing that support network of where resources might come toward you is also a very possibility that someone calls you up one day because they know you've done work and want to share an opportunity with you. So it's a two-way street. There are folks who are looking for projects that are exciting to fund, that have great impact. And, I look at this room and I see no shortage of those.
Thank you for pointing it out. And then also, these funders, if you're a funder in the room, invite us to your meetings. When I was presenting for the Healthy Diné Nation Act, I went to funders meetings, and they do have these conversations, so it's important to get engaged. Another resource is the Poanka Fund. That's an international indigenous fund. Tamal Pius, who's one of our sponsors, get connected with these funders, and also indigenous funders too. We have some rich indigenous folks. Like let's also hold them accountable, because they have some money in their pockets that they can gift to, especially the important work that we face now. Let's look at the next question. I don't know if any of you have any insight about that. Can anyone speak to the cuts we face at the end of this month surrounding SNAP Ed, for example? How can we fill the gaps? Does anyone have any insight?
I know that it's very confusing, and I know it's not even really clear because a lot of this is on the state level now. So it's been passed down to states to fill in the gap and to come up with their own criteria. So it's really confusing, and I wish I could channel some of our government relation team's energy to answer that, but it's just very unclear. I don't know if anyone else.
Yeah, I'll just mention, you know, I know a number of folks just within my personal circle who are losing their jobs due to the SNAP Ed cuts. And I think, you know, if you found yourself in this type of work and you're losing your job, obviously you're probably really passionate about it. And I think it's important to, you know, keep focus on what you're passionate about. And as we talked about coalitions building in this time, a lot of us can't foresee yet what's to come and what beautiful things are going to get built out of this unprecedented time. So coming together, you know, Denisa mentioned there's a job board here. This is a beautiful networking opportunity, this conference. So really making those key relationships, really coming together with these ideas of innovation so that we can continue doing the wonderful nutrition education and work that SNAP Ed folks have been doing.
Yes, and we are a resiliency hub for one another. So let's do a fist bump over here, Mark. Let it pop. Let it pop. Yep. Keep going. Yep. Keep going all the way around the room, everyone. Let's do this. Go then. Thank you so much, and give them a strong applause. Like this. Yeah. I see you, Lonnie. Yep. Show them your muscle. Thank you, my fellow panelists, and please connect with them. Get their contact information off of the bios. Thank you.